Namaste. Amen, and blessed be. I want to thank you again for sharing the names of those you have loved and lost. Each of us carries at least a few names, and I know for some of us the list is far, far too long. Calling out the names of these real people with real stories is way more important than anything that I could say today. Those memories that you carry are the foundation for this morning's worship. The memories and their lives are what we celebrate today. It's almost as if by naming them aloud together, we bring them back to be with us here. By saying their names, they live on in our lives. The Reverend John Wolfe, the minister in the church where I grew up, was fond of speaking of a great cloud of witnesses. It's a phrase that comes out of the Bible. In Hebrews 12, it says, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." With the great presence of those that we have known and loved, we can live with faith. We can live up to their ideals because we've learned from their strength and been inspired by their lives. We can go on. The great cloud of witnesses points to the fact that those who have passed away are still inspiring our lives today. It isn't always clear, though, how that memory will mark our lives. It can take years or even decades for that inspiration to unfold. That's because our relationships don't just stop when someone dies. Our relationships with the dead continue to evolve and live on. One of our core beliefs as Unitarian Universalists is that truth continues to be revealed. That means that religious truth was not delivered one day to one person at one point in time in its full completion. It wasn't written down in one book. It's actually never completely written. Century after century, we come to know the world and ourselves and God in new ways. A big part of that unfolding, of course, is discoveries of science and philosophy as we learn more about the world and our place in it. And part of that unfolding is in the development of new artistic expressions as we experience and express new emotional depths. But one of my big realizations this past year has been seeing that truth also unfolds as our relationships develop over time. Relationships are never static or done. We're never certain of what new nuance or change might come in the future. And as relationships evolve, especially our relationships with those closest to us, some dramatic truths can come to light. I've seen this play out in my own family as my parents embrace the memories of their parents. The evolution is particularly striking for my dad. His dad was a World War II veteran. He was captured in the Pacific and for years barely survived as a prisoner of war. He came home an emotionally and physically broken man. Shortly after his return, my dad was born. I won't go into the details, but my grandfather was a terrible father. In his PTSD, he was an abusive alcoholic. Now, my dad has two younger brothers, one of whom is significantly younger. And the father that my uncle remembers is not the one that my dad experienced. Whether the horrors of war subsided or he simply learned to be a father over the years, my grandfather seems to have changed. Since my dad left home as soon as he could for college, he never was around the house long enough to see this less violent version of his dad. Now, my dad and his brothers are pretty close today, and they're all storytellers. So often when we get together with extended family, stories of their childhood home start bubbling up. And as the three brothers spend time together, remembering family, the stories weave together and inform each other in new ways. The relationships become more nuanced. Memories from 60 years ago are still taking on new meaning today. The memories don't completely change, but as these three brothers remember their parents in different ways, truth continues to be revealed. Truth about woundedness, truth about violence, and truth about healing and family. Our relationships evolve with time, even our relationships with the dead. Earlier, I mentioned the Reverend John Wolfe and his use of the phrase, the great cloud of witnesses. Just a few months ago, John joined that great cloud of witnesses. As I said, he was the minister when I was growing up. He was the senior minister of that congregation for 30 years. And up until the day he died, he made appearances as a beloved elder. When I was young, John had this giant white beard and a booming voice and always preached in a robe. He was, to me, the embodiment of religious authority. Later, I learned about the sort of groundbreaking justice work that he had done in a deeply segregated town. And just this year, as he died, I reflected on having grown up in a church that was such a steadfast institution. And I came to appreciate him in a new way, as a builder of an institution that so many relied on. As I've grown, my appreciation for him has developed and changed. And I look forward to seeing how his legacy will inform my life in the decades to come. Like any relationship, our relationships with the dead, our memories of them develop over time. But only if we make room in our hearts to be with them. This is the appointed time of year for remembering, after all. As we heard in our children's story, Dia de los Muertos is the Mexican tradition of remembering the dead. And in the Christian and Catholic calendar, November 1st and November 2nd are All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. It doesn't take a church calendar from me, though. There's something about the fall. As the days get shorter and the nights are longer and finally the temperature drops a little bit, many of us naturally feel sentimental. And as long as those feelings aren't overwhelming, we can open our hearts and be hospitable to those memories of loved ones. One of the main pieces of Dia de los Muertos that we heard a little bit about is setting out favorite foods and drinks of the dead to symbolically feed their spirits. It also seems, at least in my family, that shared meals are the times when our departed loved ones are most present with us, especially at the holidays. We tell stories about them. We still eat their recipes. It's good to invite them to be at our table and into our hearts. even when that feeling comes with a little bit of the pain of loss. The memory can bring a great comfort. And not just a memory of people. Places from our past can also be a resting place for our weary souls sometimes. Do you remember your childhood home? Or maybe your first home as a young adult when you made it out into the world? Where have you felt good and safe and rooted? I think for each of us, there's a sense of comfort in some physical place of our past. Maybe it wasn't the home you lived in. Maybe it was a grandparent's home or a kind neighbor, or maybe it was a house of worship. Whether it's later today or this week or when the holidays come, I invite you to take some time to offer hospitality to the great cloud of witnesses and to find hospitality in the memory of safe, comfortable places of your past. Being a minister, I have the unusual privilege of participating in a lot of memorial services. Some of them are for people that I know quite well. Some are for complete strangers. The only way I know them is through the stories that their family and friends share. More often than not, the stories that are most impressive aren't about professional achievements or intellect or wealth, especially at the time of death. Most people remember the stories of how they felt. Just a few weeks ago, we held a memorial service here for Lois Huddlestone. Lois had a pretty large family. There were 19 grandchildren and children altogether. Apparently, she steadfastly baked a unique cake for each and every of their birthdays. And I think the most memorable piece of that memorial service for me was when Lois's grandson described how meaningful it was for him to get to visit her. Remember, there were 19 of them. And he said that he felt like when he was with her, he had her undivided attention. She paid so close attention to the details and remembered so much that even after a long time apart, they didn't live in the same town, she would immediately pick up the conversation where it left off. She cared individually about each person and kept up with what was going on in their lives. That's the kind of achievement that gets remembered. Remembering the dead is often a moment of reflecting on our own mortality. The death of a loved one is a time of taking stock of our legacy. I think a classic example that comes to mind is the play A Christmas Carol. We always remember the central figure of Scrooge and the three ghosts, and we remember Tiny Tim and the spirit of Christmas. We forget, though, that reflection about death is the framework for that whole play. Jacob Marley, Scrooge's deceased business partner turned ghost, is said to have died 7 years before on Christmas Eve. The whole play is set in the anniversary of a death, and we all know that anniversaries of deaths bring back some powerful memories and thought. So Scrooge is visited by three ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. In those journeys across time and across the town, they visit his lonely childhood self, and they visit the humble home of Bob Cratchit. And in each of these settings, Scrooge feels moved, but it's not until the ghost of Christmas future that takes them to see Scrooge's own passing. and to see the fact that no one mourns. In fact, people celebrate and they steal his belongings. Then and only then does the old miser begin to care more generously for the rest of the world. Only when he's faced with his own death does he feel a need to leave a legacy that's different. Now, without a doubt, A Christmas Carol is over the top. The message, though, is still present. As we remember the dead, we reflect on our own legacy. How will we be remembered? How do we want to be remembered? And how much time do we have to make the difference between those as small as possible? And remembering, we reflect on our own legacy. And we're remembering, we know that we too will be remembered. As we celebrate the great cloud of witnesses, there's a comfort in knowing that when our lives are over, we too will be remembered. There's a variety of beliefs about afterlife for Unitarian Universalists. But in our congregations, we don't make any singular promise of what comes next. That remains a question mark for most of us. What we can promise, though, is that the truth of your life, the legacy that you leave, will continue to unfold long after your last breath. Our lives may not last forever, but the mark that we leave on the world, the memories, the emotional imprint, will without a doubt shape a next generation, who will in turn pass our legacy on when they too join the great cloud of witnesses. There are no promises of what comes next. We do our part to hold up the memories of those we have lost. And in remembering them, we prepare the way to be remembered. Amen.